The story does not end with victory. It never does. When the new Chinese state finally stood on its own feet, free of foreign concessions and internal warlords, it did so with scars that ran deeper than borders or broken buildings. The memory of the opium trade was not filed away as distant history. It was carried forward, deliberately, like a wound kept visible so it would never be reopened. For the people who had lived through addiction, invasion, famine, and collapse, the past was not abstract. It was personal. Grandparents remembered parents who wasted away in opium dens. Families remembered land lost to poppy fields. Cities remembered foreign soldiers marching through streets where emperors once walked. This collective memory became something powerful, a narrative of survival. China did not see itself as merely a nation that had modernized late. It saw itself as a civilization that had been sabotaged. A civilization that had been forcibly weakened at the moment when the modern world was being shaped. And in that interpretation, the opium trade was not an isolated crime, it was the original sin of Western dominance in Asia. This belief shaped policy. It shaped diplomacy. It shaped fear. From the outside, modern China's behavior often appears defensive, even aggressive. Its insistence on sovereignty, its sensitivity to criticism, its rejection of Western moral authority, all of this confuses observers who view history as linear progress. But from inside the Chinese historical memory, these traits are logical. They are preventative. Because weakness, China learned, invites exploitation. And exploitation rarely announces itself as cruelty. It arrives dressed as trade, as progress, as opportunity. That lesson was learned when British merchants spoke of free markets while shipping drugs. When missionaries preached morality alongside gunboats. When treaties were signed under threat of annihilation. To China, these were not contradictions. They were patterns. Meanwhile, the West moved on. Britain industrialized further, its wealth secured, its empire expanding elsewhere. The opium trade faded into the background of history, replaced by narratives of abolition, reform, and modern liberalism. The East India Company was dissolved, its legacy sanitized. Museums displayed porcelain and tea sets without mentioning the silver that paid for them, or the drug that balanced the books. In the United States, the story was even quieter. American merchants who had made fortunes in the China trade were remembered as pioneers of global commerce. Their opium dealings were rarely mentioned. The young nation preferred to see itself as separate from European imperialism, ignoring how eagerly it had participated when profit was available. Selective memory became tradition. Yet history has a way of resurfacing when ignored. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, as China re-emerged as a global power, old grievances returned to relevance. Trade disputes echoed older patterns. Accusations of exploitation cut both ways. Mistrust hardened quickly because it was already familiar. When Chinese officials spoke of unequal treaties, they were not speaking metaphorically. When they rejected foreign lectures on human rights or governance, they did so with the memory of moral hypocrisy burned into national consciousness. When they invested obsessively in economic independence, technological self-sufficiency, and military deterrence, they were responding to a century when dependence proved fatal. The Opium Wars taught China that vulnerability is dangerous. And that lesson has never been unlearned. The irony is that the very system that once exploited China now fears its rise. The global order shaped during the Age of Empire assumed that nations like China would remain subordinate, markets to be opened, labor to be used, resources to be extracted. Few in the 19th century imagined a future where China would reclaim its position as a central force in world affairs. Yet that future arrived, and it arrived carrying memory. The opium trade also offers a darker mirror for the modern world. It reveals how easily moral language can be weaponized. How often, free trade has meant freedom for the powerful and compulsion for the weak. How frequently addiction, whether to drugs, resources, or profit itself, becomes a tool of control. It forces an uncomfortable question. How many modern systems depend on harm that is simply distant enough to ignore? In the 19th century, opium dens were far from London. The suffering was abstract. The profits were concrete. Today, the mechanisms may differ, but the distance remains. Supply chains stretch across continents. Consequences fall on unseen populations. Responsibility dissolves into complexity. The opium trade was not an anomaly. It was a preview. And perhaps that is why the story unsettles so deeply when examined honestly. Because it undermines the comforting belief that history naturally bends toward justice. It shows instead that power bends history toward itself, and only resistance changes its direction. China's resistance came late and at enormous cost. Tens of millions died before the cycle was broken. An empire collapsed. A civilization was traumatized. But the memory of that trauma became armor. Today, when China speaks of national rejuvenation, it is not merely invoking economic growth. It is invoking restoration of dignity, agency, and historical balance. Whether one agrees with its methods or not, the motivation is rooted in lived experience. The opium trade destroyed China's greatest empire. But it also forged something enduring. A refusal to forget. A suspicion of moral grandstanding. A belief that sovereignty must be defended relentlessly. And for the rest of the world, it leaves a warning written not in treaties or textbooks, but in the long arc of consequence. That when profit is allowed to override humanity, when power disguises itself as principle, when suffering is dismissed as collateral, the damage does not disappear. It accumulates, it waits, and eventually, it reshapes the world. The collapse of the Qing dynasty did not bring peace. It did not bring clarity. It did not even bring closure. What it brought was a vacuum. When the last emperor abdicated in 1911, ending more than 2,000 years of imperial rule, China did not step into a new era with confidence. It stumbled forward, carrying the accumulated weight of humiliation, fragmentation, and distrust. The old order had failed, but nothing stable yet existed to replace it. Power fractured immediately, splintering across regions, armies, and ideologies. Warlords rose where emperors once ruled. Each controlled his own territory, his own army, his own tax system. Loyalties shifted constantly. Violence became routine. For ordinary people, life grew even harder. Banditry flourished. Inflation soared. Famine followed instability like a shadow. And woven through it all, still present, still destructive, was opium. By the early 20th century, China was the largest opium-consuming nation on Earth. The drug that had once arrived in foreign ships was now grown domestically on a massive scale. Poppy fields covered entire provinces. Local warlords depended on opium revenue to fund their armies. Taxes were paid in narcotics. Soldiers were often paid in pipes rather than coins. Addiction was no longer just a social crisis, it was an economic system. Foreign powers watched closely. Britain's role had diminished slightly, but its influence remained. American missionaries, traders, and diplomats expanded their presence, often convinced they were helping China modernize. Japan, newly industrialized and militarized, eyed the mainland with growing ambition. Russia pressed from the north. France consolidated control in Indochina. China was surrounded, and still bleeding. Efforts to eradicate opium were made again and again, but they failed repeatedly. Every attempt threatened too many interests. Local elites resisted. Foreign traders complained. Warlords sabotaged reforms. Addiction, once introduced at scale, proved brutally resilient. Yet something new was also emerging. A generation of Chinese intellectuals, students, and reformers began to ask a dangerous question: why had China fallen so far behind? Some blamed tradition. Some blamed Confucianism. Some blamed corruption. Some blamed imperialism. Many blamed all of it. Western ideas flooded into universities and salons: democracy, socialism, nationalism, Marxism. Young Chinese studied abroad, especially in Japan and Europe, and returned with radical visions. They did not want to restore the old empire. They wanted to replace it entirely. Among these movements was a small, disciplined group inspired by the Russian Revolution. They believed China's suffering was not accidental, but systemic. That imperialism and capitalism were inseparable from exploitation. That only a complete restructuring of society could prevent another century of humiliation. They called themselves communists. Their appeal grew not despite China's trauma, but because of it. The memory of the Opium Wars, the foreign concessions, the burned palaces, and the addicted masses formed the emotional backbone of their ideology. They promised not just economic equality, but dignity. Not just reform, but revenge against weakness itself. At the same time, another force rose to challenge them: Chinese nationalism under the banner of the Nationalist Party. They sought to unify the country, expel foreign influence, and build a modern nation-state modeled partly on Western systems. The struggle between these two visions, communism and nationalism, would dominate China for decades. But before either could truly reshape the nation, an external catastrophe intervened. Japan invaded. In the 1930s, Japanese forces poured into Manchuria and then deeper into China. Cities fell. Massacres followed. The scale of brutality shocked even a population hardened by suffering. Millions died. Infrastructure was destroyed. Entire regions were devastated. Once again, China was invaded by a foreign power that saw it as weak, divided, and exploitable. Once again, the past repeated itself. Yet this time, something was different. China resisted. Not efficiently, not cleanly, but relentlessly. Nationalists and communists fought both the invader and each other, sometimes simultaneously. Guerrilla warfare spread. Rural populations were mobilized. The idea of national survival replaced regional loyalty. When World War II ended and Japan was defeated, China emerged victorious, but shattered. And the Civil War resumed. This final struggle would determine the soul of the nation. In 1949, the Communists prevailed. Mao Zedong declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. The old order was gone. Foreign concessions were dismantled. Land was redistributed. The new state promised never again to bow to external powers. And opium. It was eradicated with shocking speed. Within a few years, the largest narcotics problem in human history had been crushed through ruthless enforcement, mass mobilization, and severe punishment. Addicts were treated or imprisoned. Dealers were executed. Fields were burned. The drug that had once hollowed out an empire was wiped from the nation almost entirely. To the new government, this was not just public health. It was symbolic. A declaration that China would never again be poisoned, controlled, or humiliated by foreign forces. The memory of the opium trade became foundational to modern Chinese identity. It was taught in schools, memorialized in museums, invoked in speeches, not as ancient history, but as a warning. Never again. Meanwhile, in the West, the story faded. In Britain, the Opium Wars became footnotes in textbooks, framed as unfortunate but necessary steps in the expansion of global trade. In America, they were barely mentioned at all. The role of American merchants in the drug trade was quietly ignored. The moral contradictions were smoothed over by narratives of progress and modernization. History, after all, is often written by those who benefit from forgetting. But history does not forget. It lingers in mistrust, in suspicion, in geopolitics. When modern China challenges Western power, when it speaks of sovereignty with almost obsessive intensity, when it reacts fiercely to perceived humiliation, it is not acting from paranoia. It is acting from memory. A memory of a time when treaties were signed under threat of bombardment. When drugs were forced upon its people in the name of commerce. When moral lectures came from the same mouths that profited from addiction. The opium trade destroyed more than the Qing dynasty. It destroyed innocence. It destroyed faith in a moral world order. It taught China a brutal lesson. That power, not principle, governs international relations. And that lesson shaped everything that followed. The modern global system, with its free trade agreements, financial institutions, and economic hierarchies, was forged in this era. The same logic that justified opium in China justified exploitation elsewhere. The belief that markets mattered more than morality became embedded in global capitalism. China learned this lesson the hard way. And it resolved never to forget it. Because empires do not always fall to armies. Sometimes they fall to smoke. To pipes passed quietly in the dark. To decisions made in distant boardrooms by men who will never see the consequences. And when they fall, the world they leave behind is never the same. This is why the opium trade matters. Not as a relic of the past, but as a warning that the greatest dangers to civilizations are not always external enemies, but the systems that value profit over humanity, and power over conscience. And once unleashed, those forces are very difficult to control. The treaty that ended the war was written in ink, but enforced with cannon fire. To the British, it was a triumph of commerce. To the Qing court, it was an incomprehensible disaster. The language was alien, the legal concepts foreign, and the consequences devastating. Ports that had once been tightly controlled were now forced open. British merchants could live and trade on Chinese soil, protected not by Chinese law, but by British power. Tariffs were frozen at rates favorable to foreign interests, stripping the empire of its ability to regulate its own economy. Hong Kong, a rocky island of little interest to China, was seized outright and transformed into a permanent British foothold on the Asian mainland. And through it all, opium continued to flow. In fact, it multiplied. What had once been smuggled in secret now moved with near impunity. British merchants no longer feared confiscation. American traders, watching closely from across the Pacific, followed the same model. Families in New England and New York quietly grew rich, financing ships that carried opium east and silver west. The flags on the masts differed, but the business was the same. China's attempts to resist were no longer taken seriously. Each protest was met with diplomatic threats. Each enforcement effort was labeled an attack on trade. Each appeal to morality was dismissed as backward superstition. In London, politicians framed the conflict not as drug trafficking, but as a civilizing mission. They spoke of opening China to the modern world, of teaching it the virtues of free markets and international law. In Parliament, some voices objected, calling the opium trade immoral and shameful. But those voices were drowned out by profits, by shareholders, by an empire that had learned long ago to separate ethics from economics. In China, the consequences were now impossible to ignore. Opium dens multiplied in every city. Smoke drifted through marketplaces, villages, and government offices alike. Addiction did not discriminate. Peasants collapsed in fields. Merchants lost fortunes. Scholars failed their examinations. Officials sold justice for a pipe and a dream. Even members of the imperial court were rumored to indulge in secret. The drug hollowed out the empire not with explosions, but with exhaustion. Tax revenues fell as productivity collapsed. Grain shortages spread. Flood control systems failed from neglect. Corruption, always present, became endemic. When laws exist but are unenforced, authority becomes theater. The Qing state still performed its rituals, issued its edicts, and held its ceremonies, but fewer and fewer people believed in them. And belief, more than armies, is what holds an empire together. As weakness spread, resentment followed. Many Chinese did not blame Britain alone. They blamed the Qing dynasty itself for allowing this humiliation to happen. They blamed corrupt officials, foreign influences, and a system that seemed incapable of defending its people. Across the countryside, secret societies formed. Religious movements gained followers. Prophets preached visions of a purified China, cleansed of demons both foreign and domestic. One such man was Hong Xiuquan. He was a failed scholar, driven to madness by repeated rejection in the imperial examination system. After a series of fever dreams, he became convinced that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to rid China of evil. In any other time, he might have been dismissed as a lunatic. But this was not a stable time. His message spread like wildfire among the dispossessed, the addicted, the starving, and the angry. Millions rallied to his banner. They called themselves the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. They promised equality, land reform, and the destruction of the Qing order. What followed was one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history. For more than a decade, China tore itself apart. Entire cities were emptied. Rivers ran red. Conservative estimates place the death toll at 20 million. Some say 30. Some say more. It was not a war between nations, but a civilizational hemorrhage. And while China burned, foreign powers watched. Some intervened selectively, backing the Qing not out of loyalty, but out of self-interest. A collapsed China would be unpredictable. A weakened one was profitable. Foreign officers trained imperial troops. Western weapons were sold at a premium. The same powers that had poisoned China now sold it the tools to survive the poisoning. The irony was cruel. By the time the Taiping Rebellion was finally crushed, the Qing dynasty was exhausted beyond repair. It had survived, but only in name. Real power had fragmented. Regional generals ruled like kings. Foreign concessions expanded. Missionaries moved freely. Railways were built not for Chinese benefit, but for extraction. And opium remained everywhere. When China attempted reform, it was too late. Efforts to modernize the military, industry, and education system ran headlong into entrenched interests and chronic instability. Every reform threatened someone's profits, foreign or domestic. Every attempt to assert sovereignty risked another war. And war came again. In the 1850s, Britain returned, joined this time by France. The pretext was thin, almost laughable. A dispute over a ship. An insult to a diplomat. The real motive was clear. China had not yet been broken enough. The Second Opium War was even more humiliating than the first. Anglo-French forces marched on Beijing itself. The emperor fled. When resistance slowed their advance, the invaders made an example that would echo through history. They looted and burned the old summer palace, a masterpiece of art, architecture, and cultural memory. Priceless treasures were stolen or destroyed, not for strategic reasons, but as punishment. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens when you resist. More treaties followed. More ports opened. More privileges granted to foreigners. Opium was now fully legalized. Christianity gained protection. Foreign gunboats patrolled Chinese rivers as if they were their own. China was sovereign in theory. In practice, it was semi-colonized. To Western observers, this was progress. Trade increased. Profits soared. Newspapers spoke of opportunity in the East. Few questioned the morality of it all. Fewer still acknowledged that the wealth flowing into Western banks had been extracted from a society deliberately destabilized by narcotics. But memory is not erased by propaganda. Among the Chinese people, something hardened. A collective trauma took root. The humiliation was not just military or economic, it was psychological. For centuries, China had seen itself as the Middle Kingdom, the cultural and moral center of civilization. Now foreigners walked its streets with legal immunity, mocked its customs, and dictated its policies. This wound did not heal. It passed from generation to generation. By the end of the 19th century, the Qing dynasty was a ghost. When it finally collapsed in 1911, few mourned it. But what replaced it was chaos. Warlords fought. Japan invaded. Civil war followed. The 20th century would bring new ideologies, new revolutions, and new horrors. Yet beneath it all, the memory of the Opium Wars endured. It shaped how China viewed the West. It shaped how it understood power. It shaped its obsession with sovereignty, unity, and control. When modern Chinese leaders speak of never allowing their nation to be humiliated again, they are not speaking metaphorically. They are speaking from history, from a time when foreign empires forced drugs on their people at gunpoint and called it liberty. The opium trade did not merely weaken China. It rewired its worldview. And in doing so, it reshaped global history. Because the rise of the modern West cannot be separated from this story. The wealth, institutions, and power that define Britain and America today were built in part on a system that normalized exploitation while condemning it in others. Slavery was abolished, yet narcotics were weaponized. Moral outrage was selective. Profit was not. This contradiction still echoes. It explains why narratives of freedom ring hollow to those who remember. Why trust remains fragile. Why history, when ignored, returns in unexpected ways. And as the smoke of opium drifted across 19th century China, it carried with it the blueprint of the modern world, a world where economic power often speaks louder than ethics, and where empires rarely see themselves as villains. The empire China lost was not just political. It was psychological, and its loss would define everything that came after. In the early years of the 19th century, China did not fear the West. It had no reason to. While Europe staggered between revolutions, wars, and collapsing monarchies, China stood ancient and immovable. Its empire had endured for centuries, governed by traditions older than London, older than Paris, older than the United States itself. Its cities dwarfed anything in Europe. Its canals stitched the nation together like arteries. Its bureaucracy was so vast, so refined, that it governed hundreds of millions with ink, ritual, and obedience rather than brute force. To the Chinese court, Europe was a distant, chaotic fringe of the world, useful for tribute, amusing for trade, but fundamentally insignificant. And yet, within a single human lifetime, this same empire would be forced to its knees. Not by conquest, not by colonization, not even by invasion in the traditional sense, but by addiction. This is the story of how the most powerful civilization on Earth was hollowed out from the inside, slowly, deliberately, and profitably, by an empire that called itself civilized, moral, and free. It is the story of how Britain, aided by American merchants, built the largest drug operation in human history and unleashed it upon China. And it begins not with opium, but with tea. In the late 1700s, Britain was addicted to China. Every morning across England, from the poorest laborer to the wealthiest aristocrat, kettles boiled and teacups steamed. Tea had become more than a beverage. It was a ritual, a comfort, a symbol of empire itself. Alongside tea came silk for dresses, porcelain for tables, and lacquerware for drawing rooms. China supplied all of it. But China wanted nothing in return. British merchants arrived in Canton with holds full of wool, clocks, glassware, and manufactured goods. The Chinese glanced at them with polite indifference. They had no need for British products. Their own artisans made better goods. Their own economy was complete. So Britain paid in silver. Ship after ship sailed east heavy with bullion and returned west empty of it. By the early 1800s, this trade imbalance had become a national crisis. Britain was hemorrhaging silver to China at a scale never seen before. Economists warned of catastrophe. Politicians panicked. The empire that ruled the seas found itself economically dependent on a civilization it could not control. To the British mind, this was unacceptable. Empires do not tolerate dependence. Somewhere within the ledgers of the East India Company, Britain's most powerful corporate entity, a solution emerged. It was elegant in its cruelty. If China would not buy British goods, Britain would sell China something else. Something irresistible, something destructive, something illegal. Opium. The drug was not new. Opium had existed in China for centuries, used sparingly as medicine. But what Britain possessed was something different: industrial-scale production, refined potency, and a global distribution network enforced by the most powerful navy on Earth. The fields of Bengal in British-controlled India bloomed with poppies. Entire regions were converted into opium farms. Farmers were coerced into cultivation. Processing factories multiplied. The drug was compressed into bricks, stamped with company seals, and shipped east. Officially, Britain condemned the opium trade. Unofficially, it depended on it. The East India Company auctioned opium to private merchants, who smuggled it into China through a vast black market network. British ships anchored just offshore. Chinese smugglers ferried the drug inland. Silver flowed back out. Balance restored. Profit secured. Conscience ignored. At first, the damage was subtle. A merchant here. A dockworker there. A soldier using opium to dull the pain of exhaustion. But addiction spreads quietly, invisibly, until it does not. By the 1820s, opium dens appeared in cities and villages alike. Smoke curled through alleyways. Pipes passed from hand to trembling hand. What had once been a rare indulgence became a daily necessity. The Qing government watched with growing alarm. They banned the drug. Britain ignored the ban. They increased shipments. They refined distribution. They bribed officials. They protected smugglers. And when China tried to enforce its own laws, Britain did something extraordinary. It declared that China had no right to stop them. In the British worldview, this was not drug trafficking. This was free trade. By the 1830s, the consequences were impossible to hide. Millions were addicted. Productivity collapsed. Families sold heirlooms to buy opium. Officials embezzled funds to feed their habits. Soldiers smoked on duty. Farmers neglected their fields. Silver once again drained from China, destabilizing the economy. The empire was rotting from within. One man saw it clearly. Lin Zexu was a scholar, a moralist, and a loyal servant of the Qing dynasty. Appointed imperial commissioner, he arrived in Canton with a singular mission: end the opium trade once and for all. He shut down ports. He arrested dealers. He demanded foreign merchants surrender their opium. When they refused, he acted. In 1839, Lin Zexu seized over 20,000 chests of British opium, worth billions in today's money, and destroyed it publicly. The drug was dissolved, neutralized, and flushed into the sea. To the Chinese people, it was an act of salvation. To Britain, it was an unforgivable insult. Merchants howled. Investors panicked. Politicians fumed. Britain did not ask whether it was right to sell drugs to another civilization. It asked only whether its property had been damaged. The answer was yes. And so Britain went to war. Not for territory. Not for defense. But for the right to sell narcotics. British gunboats sailed up China's rivers, their iron hulls immune to Chinese cannons. Steam engines defied the wind. Explosive shells tore through wooden ships. Entire coastal defenses collapsed in hours. China had never seen warfare like this. The Qing army fought bravely, but tradition cannot stop technology. Spears shattered against steel. Arrows bounced off iron. Fortresses crumbled under modern artillery. The war was short. The humiliation was total. China was forced to sign treaties it did not understand, written in languages it did not speak, under the threat of further destruction. Ports were opened. Tariffs were fixed. Foreigners gained immunity from Chinese law. And worst of all, opium was effectively legalized. The drug floods returned, larger than ever. Addiction deepened. Authority eroded. The empire staggered. What followed was not recovery, but collapse layered upon collapse. Rebellions erupted across the countryside. The Taiping Rebellion alone would kill more people than World War I. Provinces broke away. Warlords rose. Foreign powers carved China into spheres of influence like meat on a table. British, French, American, Japanese, each took their share. China called it the century of humiliation. And it never forgot who started it. Because the opium trade was never just about profit. It was about power, control, and the brutal truth that the modern world was built not only on industry and innovation but on addiction, exploitation, and enforced dependency. And this was only the beginning.